Hey, my friend is having a seizure.
Where are you at?
I'm not sure what the address is. I don't live here. She was spitting up blood.
She's
I
spitting
can
up
see
blood?
coming through a little bit.
You think she's what?
Opioid abuse in the United States is at epidemic levels.
Okay.
This is probably the
This is
worst
the
drug
new young
situation in
face
our
of
country
fentanyl addiction.
in decades.
Before,
New study out shows there may be
and after.
gross underreporting of
22-year-old
opioid-related deaths, meaning
The Trump administration announced yesterday that will give $1.8 billion in grant funding to opioid addiction treatment and prevention efforts. More than 130 people in the U.S. dying each day after overdosing on opioids.
In 2015, the life expectancy for the US fell for the first time in a century. It then continued falling for the next 3 consecutive years. This drop was unprecedented and confusing for the regular citizen, but for pharmaceutical companies, it was the culmination of 3 decades of prescription drug abuse that they sponsored. This documentary will explain how Purdue Pharma began an epidemic that has been raging for more than 3 decades and has caused more than 814,000 deaths. In 1996, the opioid painkiller OxyContin was released in the US. But before we talk about that, we must go back even further. In the US, opioids for pain relief were present far before OxyContin's release. However, these painkillers were used sparingly and usually just for after major surgeries. In the 1980s and the 1990s, the perception of pain changed in the US. Medical journals and figureheads began saying that pain needed to be treated like pulse and blood pressure. This and the repeals of prescription-based related laws allowed the perfect environment for OxyContin's release. Once OxyContin was released, it was aggressively marketed both ethically and unethically. Physicians were told that it was the most versatile drug, that it could treat anything from chronic back pain to temporary joint pain. As a result of this, OxyContin's sales increased from 48 million in 1996 to 11 billion in 2000. However, the Purdue Pharma were boosting their numbers in other ways. Purdue Pharma invited physicians to stay at luxurious resorts with all expenses paid trips while they were attending medical conferences. This had a subconscious effect on the physicians. This would sway them into prescribing more OxyContin, and the most blatantly unethical tactic that was provided was monetary incentives for physicians that were prescribing OxyContin. An investigation in 2020 uncovered that Purdue Pharma was giving kickbacks to physicians that prescribed more OxyContin. When OxyContin was released, there were serious concerns that began to arise over its potential addictiveness. Purdue Pharma dispelled these accusations and aggressively pushed back against them. Emails were later revealed which detailed the CEO's opinion on the matter. The whole thing is a sham, and if people die because they abuse it, then good riddance. OxyContin's release was the catalyst for the opioid crisis and caused the rate of abuse and death to skyrocket. Sadly, this wasn't the end of the crisis. The huge influx of prescription drug abuse was only the first of 3 waves within the opioid crisis. Over the next 30 years, people would get addicted to OxyContin, then they would take opioid heroin in 2008 during the second wave, and finally they would die when injecting highly potent synthetic opioid fentanyl in the third wave. This documentary looks at the staggering fallout of the crisis, Purdue Pharma's consequences, and what can be done to halt and recover from an intergenerational epidemic.
Once you've found the right doctor and have told him or her about your pain, don't be afraid to take what they give you. Often, it will be an opioid medication. Some patients may be afraid of taking opioids because they're perceived as too strong or addictive. But that is far from actual fact. Less than 1% of patients taking opioids actually become addicted.